You think that you know the story of the War of the Worlds, a radio broadcast, mass hysteria, people running in the streets, except none of that really happened. This is Nick Susi, and he says that the War of the Worlds didn't happen the way that we remember it. What actually survived was not the moment, but the medium. A myth that we all have inherited that came from newspapers that you could hold, buy, collect, and pass on. But it gets weirder, because what Orson Welles started in 1938 is out of control today. From Tom Cruise to Ice Cube, the media that we consume, the things that we buy, and the stories we tell as a result shape the memories that we pass down.
Orson did, in fact, do this radio broadcast of War of the Worlds, but the scale of it was quite small, much smaller than we think we remember it. I think it was only like a few thousand people heard this. Far, far fewer were genuinely confused about alien invasion. And the real kind of mass hysteria that came from it after was not actually from the radio, it was from the newspapers, because the newspapers heard about this story and thought, aha, what a great moment of opportunity. And they, every newspaper across the country started to run this story about how this new evil magic technology, the radio, was brainwashing people basically into believing that aliens were invading the Earth. And that is the story that stuck. It was not the real event. It was kind of this myth of the event. And that's what we continue to repeat again and again for almost a century now. And what fascinates me about this is every aspect of this story to me really mirrors today, barreling towards economic downturn. Will World War III break out any day now? Widespread panic of AI. We're talking about banning TikTok. There's concerns about people believing everything they hear on social media and podcasts. And yet the only thing that we seem to remember about this story is that the radio made people believe aliens were invading the Earth. And so the War of the Worlds is not actually this war between humans and aliens. It's really this war between mediums, and really this story about how we as human beings love to mythologize new technologies.
In the 2025 Amazon Prime adaptation of War of the Worlds, yes, the Ice Cube one, the story unfolds through Zoom screens, group text, and Ring camera footage. It's basically a disaster movie that is told from inside your phone. And the critics hated it. 0% on Rotten Tomatoes. But that score almost misses the point. The film feels like it belongs to this moment. We have become comfortable with media that winks at us while it sells to us. Media that is stitched together from apps and feeds and smart devices. And when you watch it that way, the Ice Cube adaptation starts to look a lot less like a remake and more like a time capsule. It's documenting the way that we actually experience crisis now, through live streams, through purchases, and through the tools that we have brought into our homes. The original War of the Worlds broadcast arrived during a massive format shift. Radio was new, and it carried a kind of a mystique, a power. And in 2025, this version shows up during a similar shift. The screen has swallowed every other medium, and our lives are being routed through marketplaces and delivery networks and AI. This isn't traditional media, of course, but as a cultural artifact, it's weirdly perfect. It shows what happens when a myth survives for long enough to get retranslated through each new technology. Each version of War of the Worlds tells you less about aliens and more about the era that produced it.
I think the permanence of print probably has something to do with it. I think there's something interesting about the interplay of mediums, the kind of radio to newspaper pipeline feels like it maybe mirrors the way that I hear people talk about like the TikTok to Twitter pipeline or something. I think there's a lot of similar things we see playing out today, and how these mediums actually work together to create these stories or conspiracies, whatever the context is. But I think one of the things that came out of this research for me is really starting to understand more deeply the connection between narrative form and memory. So with the War of the Worlds, we have this story, Orson Welles using the radio, he tricks people into believing aliens are invading the Earth. And while that's not really the true story, it is this kind of cleaner, more structured story. It has clear characters. It has a clear beginning, middle, and end. You have Orson, the aliens, the public. You have Orson kind of rising and then falling and apologizing, then rising again to become one of the greatest Hollywood directors of all time. And it just strikes me that it kind of fits into this classic monomythic hero's journey narrative structure. When you look at the real story of what happened around War of the Worlds and this kind of beef between the radio and the newspapers, the real story has no real heroes or villains. There's not this simple story arc. It's just kind of this faceless technology and industries and this long, messy evolution of media and technology. And narrative form, the way that I often hear it talked about, is like, how do you tell the most entertaining story? But I really think it's also about, a container or vessel for like intergenerational memory and how these stories persist over long periods of time.
You may have already heard us say it, that the medium is the message. But what does that mean? Marshall McLuhan meant that the format of a technology shapes the meaning of whatever passes through it. A story told through the radio behaves differently from a story printed in a newspaper. One evaporates and one endures. And the War of the Worlds myth is a perfect example of that idea. The broadcast itself was fleeting. It aired once and then it vanished into the airwaves. But the newspapers were physical objects. You could buy them. You could hold them. They stayed in circulation long after the moment passed. And so the version of the story that survived was not one that people heard. It was the one they bought. The medium shaped the message, and the message became the myth. And once you see that pattern, every remake, every retelling, even the recent Amazon Screen Life version starring Ice Cube, starts to make complete sense. These stories keep returning because the mediums keep changing, and the myths follow the medium that wins.
It's so interesting how the awareness of this stuff is more in the mainstream zeitgeist, and therefore the language of this stuff, I think, is more frequently used. So kind of like your marketing example, I see, like, it was only about a month ago, I think, that one of the big TikTok trends was like things that I'm being psyoped by or won't be psyoped by. Like people are just kind of very casually talking about, conspiracy and media manipulation and stuff as if it's just an everyday thing. And I find that very fascinating, almost the normalization of that. But in using the language more, I don't actually see people being less manipulated by these things necessarily.
Magic with context creates wonder, but magic without is terrifying. When Orson's deception emerged uninvited, stripped of context, cloaked as truth, men believed, and in their belief, they were terrified. The phone lines crackled with voices, desperate and pleading.
You guys had asked me before this how this story perhaps connects to the commerce and brand piece, and what are the learnings for brands, right? And I think on one hand, the tongue-in-cheek answer is, I think the War of the Worlds teaches us that brands should make up stories and seed them to every media outlet across the country.
I don't think that's tongue-in-cheek.
to manipulate the masses into believing and act upon whatever you want them to. Yeah. So that's one lesson.
World building.
And the slightly more serious answer is, you guys brought it up before. It's like, if you want to create a monocultural event, start a war. It's like I've been going on about this for a while now, and I really do. I'm seeing that it's war and conflict and controversy, these things that bring us together at the largest of scales, whether it be the Kendrick Drake beef or Will Smith slapping Chris Rock. Oh, wow. Super Bowl, the election, actual wars in the news. Like all of these things, this is where we see the biggest spikes in social engagement, Google searches, kind of all coming from these things that really resemble conflict. And I think a lot of what came out of that work and that research is it's these things that really pull on the strings of our rage and our sense of identity. And again, this kind of mythic narrative structure of good versus evil that really kind of moves people, for better or for worse. And I am seeing this spill into the brand world too. Eugene Healy had done kind of a response piece to the work I had put out around how Poppy and Olipop are now manufacturing kind of conflict between them to generate more press and attention and social engagement. I think the most unavoidable recent example was the uproar, is even putting it lightly, around the Sydney Sweeney jeans ad, and what a war that turned into. And even with like new brands and startups, I feel like there is a certain playbook that's being run by the Cluleys and the Friends of the world that are like trying to create controversy and conflict for attention. And it really does feel like we've entered the phase of the attention economy, where the game is attention at any and all costs. While I do think it's important to stand for something and have conviction, I think there are underlying learnings here that are important. Even if these tactics work, how and when do you use them, if at all? Yeah. And also, if they're really effective at grabbing short-term attention, like what actually engenders long-term trust, I think is something that I see being kind of traded and sacrificed right now. And I wonder what the long-term implications of that will be. Like, you can monetize these controversies through creator payouts, through various social platforms. You can monetize it in the Drake and Kendrick beef sense of like streaming is also just attention based. I think politics to some degree is maybe we're seeing operating under similar mechanics, but I do wonder that when there is an actual like product on the line to buy or not buy that requires some sense of like functionality and trust and stuff, I don't know if that fully translates from like mass attention to actual purchase or even repeat purchase. But I think we'll see with a lot of these brands kind of adopting these strategies.
This is our most recent book, Lore, and in this book, Nick Susi argues in his essay, Culture is the Client, that brands often treat culture like a resource to mine rather than an audience to serve. Brands don't get to decide what culture picks and what gets tossed, or what gets repeated, what becomes myth, and what fades away. In Lore, Brian Lange writes about what he calls mythopoeic brands that don't just tell stories, but become myth machines in their own right. He shows how deeply media, format, and ownership structure change and shape those myths, and how the brand becomes the medium of the myth itself. Lore is a hardcover bound coffee table art book where we explore both of those impulses, how culture demands service, how mythology is built through commerce, and how the medium and the marketplace converge. It's 300 pages of essays, art, fiction, and research printed to last. It's an object you can hold, revisit, and pass along. Get your copy today at shop.futurecommerce.com or by clicking on the link below or using the QR code on your screen.
Nick, always a pleasure to talk to you. I actually would love to have you back.
Thank you for having me. And, I'm here as a representative of this, body of work, but it was a team effort. I do want to give a shout out to Domingo Beta, who did an awesome, incredible job with all the visual objects in creating this world. And also Verite did a very cool soundtrack around the kind of live performance of this. So, shout out to them too.